Heads. I'll go second.
All right. So I think the question ultimately is whether or not Antifa is truly anti-fascist, and does calling yourself anti-fascist, even if you're engaging in fascist behavior, does that mean that you're anti-fascist? Ultimately, I don't think that Antifa are in fact fascist. I think in the previous conversation that we were having earlier, I think that was boiling down to fascist behavior. I don't know what fascist behavior is because I'm viewing this as political violence. I think that intent behind the violence, I think, has a pretty big meaning on whether or not one is a fascist versus not a fascist. I, I do think that political violence is pretty ideologically blind. That is to say, anybody on the entire political spectrum, ideological spectrum, can and sometimes does engage in political violence. So I think to boil down political violence to saying any act of violence is fascist, I think kind of results in reductio ad absurdum. That is to say, it's pretty absurd because then anything becomes the same thing. And I think in order to understand these things, they have to have fundamental meaning. Um, so I think that's where I'm going to start.
Well, I mean, for those of you guys who know about my religion, Zen is one of those core concepts to it. It's really about finding the center and origin of things. This debate, that's kind of what we're identifying is the very origin of what defines fascist behavior. Antifa is in fact fascist, and I plan to demonstrate that. And yes, a big component is the fact that they engage in political violence. The part thing here is the context political violence. There is legitimate political violence when you're defending yourself from totalitarians. There's legitimate political violence when you're defending yourself from extremists. But to prove that, you have to prove that your life is in danger. Unfortunately, with the left, we see them engage in political violence. They come up with a convoluted, reason for why their life is in danger, and it never really is. But again, it's just a pretext for them to commit to violence in order to impose their beliefs on others, which is fascism. Antifa has very clearly in the past engaged in that kind of violence. It is unprovoked violence on people who are not engaging in violent acts against them and merely expressing opinions they feel are contrary to theirs. And instead of engaging with those opinions or engaging with those beliefs, they find it simpler to call the person with those beliefs fascist and attempt to attack them, take their life, brutalize them, etc. This is exactly, you know, what plenty of fascist groups have done in the past, where it's the brown shirts, or I would even argue the KKK count as a fascist group in context. So basically, that's what I'd like to demonstrate the exact examples of this. But I'm sure you'll all agree again, fascism in itself, a huge component of it is the use of political violence unprovoked against somebody you don't share beliefs with in order to impose your beliefs on others when they're just basically indefensible. I'm done.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think the frequency is with which Antifa are, quote, murdering other individuals. I'm also curious what you think the ideology is that Antifa are trying to, quote, shove down the throats of people that don't agree with them. From my understanding, Antifa, yes, they do engage in violence and they do perpetuate that from a perspective of self defense that is rooted, I think, in historical precedents, whether that's across the world. I know with respect to Portland, it had to do with, skinheads essentially walking down the streets with clubs. I don't know that it's necessary to dive into the history, but Antifa certainly views anti-racist and fascist rhetoric as fundamentally harmful to society. In fact, I would question anybody who is going to claim that Antifa is for anything, when in fact their entire foundation is absolute opposition to fascism. Uh, I would hesitate to even say that they're egalitarian. I don't even know that they're pushing any belief. So I have profound questions about what your understanding of Antifa is. Like, what are they pushing? That's it.
Alrighty, I'm good to go here.
Yes.
Unhinged. Gotcha. Okay, so you want to talk about ideology here. Let's go back to one of the very early Antifa incidents, the 2017 Berkeley protests, otherwise known as Battle of Berkeley. Again, this was unprovoked violence from Antifa, beginning with an attack on a speech by Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley University. And I think it was about 150 Black Bloc protesters entered the crowd, people began attacking attendees, and began running shit. And this went on for a few days, culminating in a couple of street rallies. I think there was a canceled Unite the Right rally where people still showed up and the Antifa activists showed up and immediately began attacking people there who had not engaged in any violent acts against them. So, when we're talking ideology, I've got the Wikipedia page pulled up here, and they list this like a battle. They have parties involved in battle. On the side of the antagonists, the Antifa, we've got Antifa, socialists, anarchists, by any means necessary, which is a socialist group, National Socialist Organization, etc., etc. Antifa in our country is attempting to impose socialism. Their violence began as far back as 2015. I mentioned by any means necessary. That group in 2015 began attacks on Trump supporters and Trump rallies in California. These were people peacefully assembling to listen to their presidential candidate, and they were egged, they were beaten, and bloody. This is exactly what the Nazis, exactly what the brown shirts did in the very early days of the Third Reich. They went after Jewish people. They went after Jewish people who were minding their own business. They beat them up. They took their guns. They destroyed their business. And it was unprovoked. And it was to push the fascist ideology of the National Socialist Party. Antifa is beating the shit out of people because their political party has been constantly losing. And they're clearly pushing socialism because when you look at the list of people associated with Antifa, you see social. Again, these are people who can't defend their ideas and have decided instead to beat the shit out of people. You can go ahead now, Tacit. Sorry.
No, you're good. So I think we need to understand again the difference between Antifa and fascism. And so I think some core, like, fundamental differences. One is I think we need to view Antifa as it truly is, which is a decentralized network of like-minded people that oppose fascism. If we were to, like, I would hesitate to even call it a party, because it really isn't. Parties are centralized. Um, y- uh, examples being the obvious ones, Democrat and Republican. Antifa is not a political party. It has no common structure. They oppose uh, any kind of hierarchy, which is not the same as fascism. Fascism is pro-authoritarian. Now, that is not to say, and I do acknowledge the fact that there are clearly socialists, communists, anarchists. I mean, anarchism is probably the bigger root to Antifa than to the history of Antifa than I would even say socialism. But I mean, that's a whole soapbox rabbit hole we don't need to dive into. The point is that Antifa has no ideological structure. In fact, I would say it is ideologically diverse. It's just a bunch of like-minded individuals who fundamentally do not agree with an authoritarian structure. Where they do, I think where the premise of this the whole entire debate idea came up was around political violence. And so while Antifa and fascists can be militant, militancy has to do with a bottom-up approach by using violence to change behavior. Whereas militarism is a top-down approach that says the state should have a strong military in order to enforce our structure. Antifa does not agree with a militarism structure. Now, that's not to say individual members might, because obviously there are examples of socialist countries who are militaristic, but I don't think it's fair to say that Antifa is the same as a socialist. That's the same as a fascist. It's the same, because then everything again becomes the same thing. And so I think when we look at Antifa as it truly is, it is not a political party. The only intention behind Antifa is to stop the perceived or real threat that political violence comes from a fascist dictatorship. And I think we can all agree that fascism is bad, except maybe like one person in this group. So I think from there I'll let you respond.
First off, at no point did anybody claim Antifa was a party. It's definitely aligned with the party. And again, they are aligned with very socialist ideals. But it's also ridiculous to say that Antifa are not organized. They have a very organized and structured network. They've got local groups. They have a communications network. They publish things. They maintain mailing lists. They organize violent assaults on people. And they do it very efficiently because they have an organized structure. Antifa is not a political party. It is a domestic terrorist group. And again, we're going back to this whole argument, militarism, fascism. Again, as I stated in my last, little tirade here, as I stated, fascism is essentially using force to push your ideology on other people. Nazis, who we acknowledge are fascists, even though they were national socialists, forcibly impose their ideas with violence, same way Antifa does. Just like Antifa, Nazis identified the Jews as a threat and used them as a rallying point. In terms of Antifa, they will literally attack anybody who's conservative. Again, as you said, perceived threat. They have drummed up a perceived threat. If they're not in power, then the person or someone they like is not in power, then they're under an authoritarian regime. Granny holding a sign saying she's pro-life is a threat to them. That's kind of the thing we're dealing with. That's the mentality. Say that they're not organized. That's denying reality. They're very seeing it right now. We're seeing it in Minneapolis. These are Antifa groups, and they're very, very organized, chasing federal officers and at assaulting people in the streets. There was just a video of some random influencer getting assaulted in his car because he had a face mask on and they thought he was ICE. Again, this is all very fascist behavior, very night of the broken glass kind of shit. Because with Antifa, it always ends in riots, it always ends in property destruction. I mean, again, can you really defend this behavior, Tacit? Can you defend the behavior, the inauguration of Donald Trump, when they literally destroyed downtown Washington, D.C. and burned private property? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make clear I didn't say that they weren't organized. I said that they're not a political party, similar to Democrats, Republicans. What I was speaking to is that fascists believe in a highly centralized state, that they fundamentally believe in a top down infrastructure. They believe in a strong leader versus a democratic society. Um, uh, fascist dictatorships are highly centralized. Antifa is not at all centralized. That is to say, while they are organized, they through mutual aid networks, things like Discord, or WhatsApp, Signal, whatever. They communicate through that kind of a structure. Um, I'm not saying they're not organized. Clearly, they're organized, um, but that's also well within their right, the First Amendment, to assemble. So I don't see any issue with that. So again, isn't centralized. They don't have a philosophy on centralization. They beyond the fact that they think that their efforts are more successful by not having that kind of infrastructure. And I do want to point to Center for Strategic and International Studies because I brought this up. I think I asked maybe two moments ago how often you think this violence happens. And 2025, according to CSIS, is probably the most violent the left has been since the 1960s, um, and still not even at that peak. Even with that said, um, since 1994 to 2020, they made a database of about 893 terrorist incidents, and of those incidents, um, only 22 deaths were related to specifically left-wing extremism, not even necessarily Antifa, just left-wing extremism, as opposed to 335 fatalities from right wing. And so when somebody says that these people are concocting a narrative of violence, there are decades and decades of evidence to say and show, and studies that constantly show that political violence more often comes from the right. Now, that's not me justifying political violence. I want to make very clear that I do not agree with political violence. And I do think that anytime a politically extreme entity shows up at any large gathering of people, there is more likely to become a riot. Now, that isn't just about Antifa. That could be any of the other 17 people that decided to fight in the incident, the 2017 incident that you brought up. That became violent not because Antifa, that became violent because multiple groups. The mere presence of Antifa does not automatically make a situation violent. And so I think that's really important narrative here that keeps getting sidelined. I don't think Antifa is a terror group. And in fact, Trump's first term, his own FBI, his own intelligence agencies said that they were not at all even a risk. They were not even considered a remote threat. However, right wing groups definitely were because they were in fact killing multiple individuals. You can go ahead.
With let me burst your bubble about the strategic intelligence, whatever. That's an independent think group. That's not a government entity, and often those groups end up very partisan. In this case, they have probably ignored plenty of incidents of left wing ideological terrorism, maybe by not qualifying eco terrorism among that. Beyond that, again, you want to go back to the all the right is just violent too. That's completely baloney. Individual, tiny, centered, way off extremist groups might get violent once in a while, and they immediately get put down. But yes, I will state mere presence Antifa does result in political violence because they are agitators come to groups expecting violence. Back to the 2017 thing, yes, they did instigate violence at these rallies. 150 of them came in and began burning shit and assaulting college students who were unarmed, who were there to listen to someone speak. because they didn't like the person speaking. And a few days later, when they assaulted a bunch of right wing groups on the streets of Berkeley, merely convened, they instigated it. Now, as for Trump's FBI in his first term, anybody paying attention to his first term knows, unfortunately, a lot of people were appointed who shouldn't have been appointed, who were qualified to hold those roles because they were very invested in keeping the status quo. You know, the fact that Trump's FBI said this shit when you had 8 individually identifying this group as a terrorist thing just shows you exactly why Christopher Wray should never have been allowed to sit in the Hoover building. Because in Trump's first term, Antifa assaulted unarmed people. Antifa took over an entire neighborhood in Seattle. They attacked federal courthouse. They attacked immigration and customs enforcement center. And they did it with extreme violence, often armed, unprovoked. I mean, with the courthouse, there was arson involved. Shit you have not heard coming out of the right, you know, because that is disorganized, that is diffuse, that is centralized. Antifa, however, is centralized and organized against this current administration. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna challenge your rejection of the citation from CSIS. They are considered a pretty prominent and bipartisan, very pro-defense organization, and I would argue that literature coming from think tanks, particularly one like this one, is going to lean much more unbiased. And they do talk about eco-terrorism. They do talk about not just this article, but I mean they have a lot of literature about extremism because extremism is from abroad more specifically is a concern for national security. So I would maybe say before you reject this source. I posted this in the links, or at least the one that I was referring to. I would perhaps recommend understanding that before you just outright reject it. I'm also going to reject your claim that the Seattle piece is all about Antifa. While I'm sure there were Antifa people in there, I don't even think the people that created that autonomous zone, by and large, even said they were Antifa. That's not to say there weren't folks there, like I said, but I think what is ultimately happening is anytime we see left wing violence, it's automatically being accused of being Antifa related. And I think that is a fundamental flaw. And I think that is a fundamental flaw because it goes all the way back to the first time the word fascism was uttered into the universe, because that's what the left does to the right. In fact, that's what the left does to the left. Anytime that we disagree with somebody, we say fascist. Anytime, like I would argue that that's exactly what's happening here. Anytime that we see a conservative, oh, they must be a fascist. Oh, they like big government and they are conservative. Well, they must be a fascist. I think we need to fundamentally get back to the basics on what is and isn't Antifa versus fascist. Like these words have to mean things. Otherwise, we end up like others in this group and we say things like, well, all of X are X. No, that is absolutely false. Not all left-leaning political violence is from anti-fascism. It's baffling to me that we continue to do this. Um, and again, I don't like well coordinated and organized is not the same as being centralized. Like that, we have to agree on something, on the basics here. These are just basic principles of governance. And Antifa is not centralized. They may be coordinated, but they are not at all centralized. Again, none of this is me defending Antifa or saying that I am pro Antifa. It is about words having fundamental meanings here. Um, Antifa is opposed to a thing. fascism is in favor of a thing. If you were to ask somebody that is in Antifa or that says I'm Antifa, ask them what they believe in. I am going to reckon that they are probably not going to say much when you boil it down to just the anti-fascism. Um, I'll leave it for there.
Well, that's like saying the Nazis weren't fascists, they were just anti-Jewish and anti-gay and anti-black and anti-gypsy. You know, they were against a lot of things, and they were also for a lot of still remained fascist. I wanted to get that out of the way real quick because that was just the first thing I wanted to say. As for your Center for Strategic and International Studies, I look at it again. Not really going to take much from a steamed think tank. There are a lot of these think tanks out there say a lot of stuff that ends up being utter bullcrap. Steamed think tanks out there that talk about how much gun violence is and how many school shootings there are. And then you find out that in their statistics, they might have included sides as gun violence or a shooting for a school as a school shooting, even though it wasn't in the school. A lot of very esteemed and very respected think tanks love to spew things to push their narrative. And in this case, it's a never Trump, oh, they're just centralized narrative. With the Antifa thing, you're also saying just because they were there doesn't mean they organized. Again, that's just like saying just because the Nazis or the brown shirts broke a bunch of windows and stuff and beat up Jews, that the Nazis weren't responsible for it. You know, just because they were there, they weren't responsible for it. It's a silly argument. I mean, beyond that, I challenge you to show me an instance where an anti-fascist group has had any dissent from the core narrative we see from anti-fascists. And again, it's quite easy to spot anti-fascist. I don't just assume any idiot rioter is Antifa. I'm looking for some signs. I'm looking for the wording and the imagery in their posters they use to organize. I'm looking for baklavas and coverings. I'm looking for violent behavior. I'm looking for riot shields and stuff like that. Antifa is very easy to identify. They come concealing their identity and they come armed for violence and ready for violence and ready to instigate violence. It's just as easy as identifying a Klan member when you know what to look for. Which again is why not a centralized political party are a centralized domestic terrorist group engaging in violent fascist behavior. Just because they say they're against something doesn't mean they're not this thing that they're against. Oh, go ahead.
Um, yeah, there has been no evidence, or I should say, very little evidence that Antifa coordinated the Portland autonomous zone. The other thing that I do want to maybe just emphasize here is maybe the engaging you're engaging of a genetic fallacy. That is to say, you're simply rejecting a source because it comes from a think tank. It's kind of the same logical basis you are in assuming that all violent acts that are based on politics must be fascist, as if we haven't seen political violence since the dawn of governments. Political violence predated fascism. Um, by millennia. So I'm baffled a little bit as to why you're just going to go ahead and reject this. Um, and I would argue that that is a logical fallacy that weakens your point. I would like to hear more about um, you're challenging with actual evidence. If you have an example in which the sources are not, like CSIS is not providing the ample evidence, I don't think it's sufficient to just say, well, that's a think tank, therefore it's bad. That is absurd. That is an example of absurd logic. Um, respectfully speaking. Um, you asked me to give an example, and admittedly, I don't quite exactly know what you were asking. So if you could repeat that question, I'll answer that in my follow up to your next piece here. But I think my takeaway here is that it's easy to pull an example of any time a fascist punches another person, or I'm sorry, an anti-fascist punches somebody in the face. But by and large, and this is true for every extreme, by and large, Antifa do not engage in political violence. That is consistently reported. Whether I mean, I can find a dozen sources if you want to right now that's going to repeat the same exact thing. And my concern with even attempting to do that is you're probably going to say that every single one of those sources is fake, false, some false narrative. And so that makes it impossible for me to prove my point because you're going to reject it. So if you want to give me place where I can start so I can help you understand the statistical reality of how nonviolent Antifa is, I'm happy to do that. Your go.
Statistics are a great thing, Tacitus. The only problem is 66% of the time you can get any result you want. That's a bad joke. The problem is you're going to quote me statistics, of course, that support your point from a source that wants to support that point. As we've seen with a lot of left-leaning group statistics, their relationship with reality isn't that great. I mean, Muriel Bowser kept saying that statistically crime had dropped in D.C. The problem was, it turns out her police lieutenants falsifying data, ignoring events that took place that were of a criminal nature. So if you're going to show me statistics, make sure they're coming from a good source. If you want to prove to me that Antifa are not fascists, show me a picture worth 1,000 words. Show me a picture or a video of somebody initiating the violence against Antifa, but I pretty much believe you won't be able to find that. Because wherever the black bloc Antifa show up, violence begins. Now, again, to requote my question to you, though, it was, show me an example of an Antifa group that took up an opinion contrary to Antifa's core beliefs, i.e., socialism, pro-illegal immigration. Show me something where they might have defended a Christian, for example, who was under attack by one of their peers or something like that. Show me something where they went against the grain of what we are typically seeing from the very organized Antifa. Show me somebody not singing from the same hymn sheet, if you will. I don't know how much time I have left to address your other point about political violence. You're right. Political violence existed millennia before Antifa even started. The difference is political violence for many millennia was less about ideology and more about one's nation, one's lead, you know. Political violence based on ideology pretty much started when we were having kings, unless you want to count religion. I guess religious ideology count. But, political violence based on pure ideology, divorced from nation and faith, is a relatively new thing. So fascist political violence, you're right, relatively new to it. I think it's very easy to identify just by looking at the reality of it. Look at the reality of things like the Antifa assaults, Trump rallies in 2015. Why don't you compare that to some beaten and bloody Jews from Germany? And I don't think you're going to see a difference in the outcome. Go on.
You name a source that you think is going to qualify, or a series of sources, and I'm happy to look it up. My guess, though, is that none of those places are going to be discussing these things. Again, you're blanket, essentially, you're blanket banning any potential source for me to demonstrate that this is a consistently found issue. Um, I also want to say that groups like the Proud Boys, the Patriot Prayer, Oath Keepers. There's another one like I want to say it has with a Dawn in the name. Um, they frequently do the same things, chasing after Antifa. It is not uncommon for these groups to literally just get out in the streets and brawl. But again, that is about being militant um, towards ideas.